Mending fences, NATO and Russia decide to start a new era after relations were dealt a severe blow over the war in Georgia. But do both sides really need each other, and why? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. There could be a thaw in Russia's relationship with the West. NATO has agreed to resume meetings with Russia as soon as possible. The decision to resurrect the NATO-Russia Council, known as the NRC, was made at a meeting of foreign ministers last week. Relations soured between Western powers and Russia after last August's war in Georgia. Now, NATO says despite these friendly overtures, Russia will be urged to discuss all areas where they agree and disagree. So why is it important that the two sides talk to each other? Well, for one, NATO and Russia need to work together in Afghanistan. Stability in Afghanistan is in the national interest of Russia, while NATO needs new supply lines into the country via Russia. In addition, Russia's contribution in Afghanistan could also include a joint training centre and the use of Russian equipment to train troops. Russia could also help NATO address the issue of the nuclear programs of both Iran and North Korea, the two countries that have no ties with NATO but are friends with Russia. In return, Russia wants the US to drop the contentious defensive missile shield in Eastern Europe. As part of a Middle East quartet, Moscow could also potentially help resolve the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Well, the NATO decision comes at the same time as the US appears to be opening lines of communication with its former enemy. In February, Barack Obama wrote to his Russian counterpart, Dmitry Medvedev. After the NATO meeting last week, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Geneva. And this is what he had to say.
I noticed the readiness of our American partners for dialogue on matters that are of mutual interest. I'm certain that in the near future we're going to try to reach agreements or results which would bring us closer to political and diplomatic solutions.
Well, the US Secretary of State echoed Lavrov's sentiments and pointed to a warmer relationship between the two nations.
It was, Sergei, a good beginning from my perspective, and we will continue to work closely together in the coming months. There is a lot of work to be done. We think that this is a fresh start, not only to improve our bilateral relationship, but to lead the world in important areas, particularly with respect to nuclear weapons and nuclear security.
Well, joining us are our guests in Manhattan, Kansas State, Dale Herspring. He's a professor of political science at Kansas State University, and he spent over 20 years at the US State Department's Foreign Service. And in Moscow, Dmitry Babich, a political analyst for Russia Profile magazine. Welcome both. Dmitry Babich, if I may start with you. We've been hearing the kind of drip of a global thawing in many key diplomatic arenas and countries since Obama took office. The NATO-Russian relationship is next out of the freezer, if you like. Why is everyone deciding now they'd be better off being buddies, do you think?
Well, just because the old administration made so many mistakes. The contradictions between Russia and the United States certainly exist, but they are not unsurmountable. They are not like the contradictions between the United States and the Muslim fundamentalists. So basically, there was nothing preventing Russian-American relations from improving. The old administration, just instead of concentrating on really important matters, paid a lot of attention to some residual fears from the Cold War. That's why everyone is so optimistic now, just because the actions of the old administration are so difficult to explain.
So, Dale Herspring, the old administration is to blame for the current state of poor relations between the two countries. Would you agree with that?
Not totally, but I think it's I think Mr. Babich is right. I think the old regime, certainly with the neocons in the Pentagon, had their own view of the world, and they looked upon Russia as a nation that was in economic doldrums, militarily unimportant, diplomatically not very important, and I think that was a big mistake. Speaking as one who spent more than most of his life dealing with U.S.-Russian relations, I think that was silly. The fact is we both need each other, and I think that Mrs. Clinton's done an excellent job of trying to revive them. I wouldn't suggest that we've made a breakthrough, But I think we certainly now have issues in play that were not in play, and there's interest in both sides to try and reach some sort of agreement. The devil will be in the details, it always is, but I think we at least now have begun to, the impetus is in a positive direction.
You say you both need each other, the West needs Russia and Russia needs the West, but doesn't, in fact, the West need Russia more, and therefore Russia can drive the harder bargain?
I don't see that to be the case. I mean, I think that Russia does not want those missiles going in, and the missiles are now in play. And the United States does not want Iran with nuclear weapons. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, it's in both countries' interest. Mr. Makarov, General Makarov has said very clearly that it's in Russia's interest for the United States, for NATO to prevail. As far as Iran and the missiles, I think there's a possibility of a deal there.
So, Mr. Babich, in Russia's interest for NATO to prevail, is that the case?
Well, I think that in Afghanistan, certainly Russia would like the NATO to prevail, although lately we have heard some skeptic statements about this from some of the very important figures in the Kremlin. But in general, the problem is that the West indeed needs Russia for its oil and gas, and the West will never go away from Russia completely simply because it needs our oil and gas. Russia needs the West even more because we need Western technology and we want to be a part of the West. That's the problem.
But NATO, of course, strongly disagree with a number of Moscow's actions in the past, including its recognition of the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Georgia's breakaway regions, a country at which Russia was with war. How do you overcome problems like that?
Well, it's very easy, actually. The problem is with the United States attitude to the former Soviet republics, which are now independent countries. In any conflict that these countries have with Russia, the United States always supports the weaker side, meaning the new independent states. And with Georgia, the amount of that support was just absurd. I don't want to say that Russia was always right in its actions, but certainly the Western position on these conflicts was one-sided.
So, Dale Herspring, do you think there could be a certain amount of horse trading here over issues like South Ossetia and Abkhazia?
I don't see much movement in that. I don't see much movement from the Russian position. They're moving to establish military bases in both of them. I think that's a fait accompli from the Russian standpoint. And on Georgia, I think that we're just going to have to agree to disagree on that issue. I don't see much movement. I think the issues are much more movable in terms of the ones I mentioned earlier.
What about the depth of feelings of those former Soviet states like Lithuania and so forth, that this new thawing actually demonstrates a weakening of NATO's resolve, Mr. Herspring?
I don't think that's I mean, I can understand they're nervous, and I understand the feelings on the Baltic republics, but I don't think that the resolve has gone down. I mean, first of all, look at the geographical difference. I think there are a number of people in the United States that recognize that the Russians have an argument. We started off with the reunification of Germany with a pledge there would be no further increase in NATO. And then we had the Clinton administration come in, and we had the three, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland went in, and it's expanded further beyond that. And I think the Russians have laid down a marker. As far as the Baltics is concerned, I think that would be just political suicide to do anything against the Baltics.
So Mr. Babich, the thing is, this NATO-Russian Council was established back in 2002, and it so far proved to be pretty toothless, isn't it? You had high hopes of cooperation, but it's really failed to live up to expectations, hasn't it?
Well, I think the reason why it failed to live up to expectations is very simple. Russia-US relations were not as good as they appeared to be becoming in 2002. I would remind you that in 2002 and 2001, Russia helped the United States to defeat Taliban in Afghanistan. Russia, in fact, armed the so-called Northern Alliance, which did most of the work in driving the Taliban out of power. Since then, relations worsened. And every time they worsened over crisis where the West was, in fact, the initiator. the expansion of the EU and NATO, the problems with the ABM deployment in Poland, and the situation in Georgia, which was indeed sparked off by Georgia's attack against South Ossetia, supported by the West, in fact.
Well, let me put to you the words of a NATO diplomat about the NATO-Russian Council. He says that in the past there was a lot of frustration that Russians would come to meetings with simply just a lot of rhetoric. There was never the sense that they really wanted to work with NATO. What do you say to that, Mr. Babic?
Maybe it was the case from the point of view of Western diplomats, but indeed our diplomats didn't have much of a choice, because the attitude of the old administration was very simple. The ABM missiles have to be deployed and you have to accept it. You may send your generals, we'll show them something, but you have to accept what we say. There will be no concessions from our side. So our diplomats had nothing else but to indulge in some rhetoric. I think that was natural.
So, Mr. Herspringer, are we on the brink of seeing concessions from both sides?
I certainly think so, because, as Mr. Babic correctly stated, the missiles were simply fait accompli as far as the Bush administration was concerned. They're now in play, and I think the letter that was sent made that very clear, what the arrangement will be, what kind of a negotiation. Most of that, you see 10%, 90% of it's going to be done behind closed doors, not in the newspapers, and I frankly don't know where the give and take is. And as far as what Mr. Babic says, I think that both countries have made some tragic mistakes. I think that there's no question that Saakashvili started the war in Georgia. The Russians way overreacted in some of their actions. And so, but I think that I would throw the marker of who's to blame at both doors.
All right, well, plenty more to talk about, especially the give and take, more about the thaw in NATO-Russia ties, and also about the Obama administration's moves to engage with Moscow. Stay with Inside Story.